I came across this tweet the other day, and I think it is worth addressing and taking seriously. Jesus, throughout the New Testament, talked about how his followers should think about and treat the poor. We should clothe them, feed them, open our homes to them, and live with a general sense of generosity and open-handedness with everything that we have. There is no question that Lana is correct about what Jesus asked us to do as Christians. The thing that goes without being said is the who and the how. I think it is crucial to define socialism, or what a socialist is calling for. Now, I will admit that it is difficult to give a single definition of socialism, but here is a description of socialism loosely based on a video by economist Richard Wolff. An economic system based on markets where the government regulates private companies enough to make them less self-serving and more socially oriented. An example would be their push for a higher minimum wage. Socialists also want the government to come in and redistribute through taxes the wealth in a given nation to make it more equal. For socialists, their end goal and their desired result of people being fed and clothed and housed is very much like Jesus' call to the church. But the path taken seems to be a little bit different. And we'll look closely at those different paths with my special guest, Dr. Corey Miller. Welcome, doubters, to Dealing with Deconstruction. If you find yourself questioning some of your deepest held beliefs and wondering if you can hold on to your Christian faith, you are in the right place. This is a safe place where we examine the questions that people on the same journey ask, and we are looking for truth. If you feel lonely and ask many of those bigger-than-life questions, please consider subscribing. Also, consider shooting me an email with some of your story. Today, we will answer the question of Jesus being a socialist with my friend, scholar, and former colleague, Dr. Corey Miller. Dr. Miller has a PhD, and he is the president of Ratio Christi and the CEO. He taught philosophy and comparative religions at Indiana University for 12 years. He is also the author or co-author of 4 books. Dr. Miller holds a master's degree in philosophy, biblical studies, and in philosophy of religion and ethics. His PhD is in philosophical theology from the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. He is passionate about defending and proclaiming the truth of the gospel in a winsome and bold way. Corey Miller, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here with you, Tim. Love the title of the show and what you're doing here.
Well, I appreciate that, Corey. And man, I'm looking forward to this conversation. So the first thing that I would love to get your thoughts on is Lana's tweet. Let's go ahead and look at that one more time here on the screen. She says that Jesus, she's kind of quoting and paraphrasing Jesus here. He talks about feeding the hungry and clothing the homeless and caring for those less fortunate than you and welcoming foreigners and loving your neighbor in the same way you love yourself. And us Christians would say, yes, good. And Lana would say, yeah, what he said, let's do that. And then it turns to us Christians saying, go F yourself, dirty commie libtard. So how would you respond? How would you react to Lana's tweet here?
Wow. First of all, just wow. I would say she's got a vision of Jesus, and everybody wants to have their vision of Jesus and use him and abuse him and manipulate him for their purposes. But we need to take Jesus in his context. You know, even the expression, what would Jesus do? Sounds great on the surface because we think about Jesus from a Christian viewpoint as the virtuous person that the Greeks would have asked, what would the virtuous person do? And that's him.
Yeah.
But there are many things even that Jesus would and should do that are distinct for his particular calling when he came to this world that Christians don't need to. For example, Jesus wouldn't have sex. So he wouldn't have children. That doesn't mean we shouldn't. Jesus may not be a law enforcement officer ready to shoot someone. Or if he were a judge sitting on a court situation in a trial, someone might expect him to exonerate the person rather than to sentence him to death or whatever. So everybody throws their what would Jesus do moment in there. But I think what we need to do is start getting him in context, in the biblical context.
And so explain what a little bit of that context is, because you're right. We're looking at what would Jesus do in our 21st century lens and our American economy lens. And I think that you and I would both agree that there has been times when the church has dropped the ball when it comes to generosity, and there are things that the church, particularly in America, should step up its game in doing some of those things in that tweet. And so I think we could agree on some of those things. So what's the context we should be understanding Jesus in that we're missing in our 21st century context here?
Well, Jesus was a Jew, for one, and
Okay.
therefore he took the Old Testament, or the Tanakh, the Hebrew Old Testament, seriously. And so anything that Jesus would do can't be inconsistent with the principles of the ethics of the Old Testament in their core. There were some things that were, relegated to specific covenants of the Old Testament, to the Mosaic covenant, that even those living outside of that covenant are no longer bound by. But we have to consider, too, that Jesus was on a mission to go to the cross. And so whereas he wouldn't be a father and have children, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be. Or, some people become pacifists because they read the Sermon on the Mount or something like that. But then you find other passages in the New Testament that seem to open up possibilities. In our organization, some people disagree with us litigating, and we develop a theology of litigation. They would say, well, what would Jesus do? Jesus never would have sued the state. They would never sue Caesar. But what would Paul do? Paul litigated the heck out of people in one sense. He appealed to Caesar for his Roman citizenship. And so even as Christians, we need to be very careful in asking that nuanced question, what would Jesus do? We need to read Jesus in the biblical context and then find out the principles that were in the Old and New Testament that are legitimately transferable to us today, that are universal, that are timeless truths, not ones that are bound by a particular covenant or bound by a particular mission in life.
So particularly some of those principles when it comes to economics, what are the ones that we should draw out to apply to our context today?
Justice, for one.
Okay.
We should have equal measures in that sense. We shouldn't be oppressing people. The Bible is clear that God hates oppression. But we should not necessarily think of justice as equality, or that inequality entails injustice. Jesus never condemned inequality. He condemned oppression. The Bible never condemns inequality. It condemns oppression. And the issue with wealth was not that it's a bad thing. In fact, there are numerous passages that talk about the production of wealth as a good thing. It's not the possession of wealth and property, it's the obsession with it and the oppression of it.
That's a good distinction, yeah. Yeah. So I know that we need to bring up a couple things here. One of them is the model of Acts 2, where it talks about the church. It talks about them not having any needs within the church, and people gave freely to one another. And I can just imagine people saying, and I've had people say this to me, why can't America, why can't my neighborhood, my community be just like that? And have the government as the thing that we all share in common, if you will, as a philosophy of the state, be just like the church. Don't you want to be able to give to your neighbor or give to somebody down the street or in the next town over? It's a small sacrifice for you to be able to pay 0.5% more so that someone else can have health care, or that someone else can have a house or something like that. How would we respond to the difference between the model of the church in Acts 2 in our governmental system today and the role of government?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people try to take the New Testament, and that passage is a crux passage of the New Testament, think that the New Testament teaches some kind of government-warranted socialism. But the difference between, let's say, the socialism that we think of today in our modern times from Karl Marx onward is one that deals with government control and redistribution of wealth. It's kind of a Robin Hood mentality where you rob from the poor or the rich and give to the poor, and you do it forcibly and you look heroic. Well, in that passage in the New Testament, that's not what's going on there at all. First of all, the whole issue was they brought their personal property, their personal possessions. They owned those things, and they voluntarily gave them up. I mean, again, Jesus being a Jew, the early Christians being Christ followers, that was connected to the Judaism. You begin with the 10 Commandments, and two of those 10 Commandments, Commandments 8 and 10, thou shalt not steal and thou shalt not covet your neighbor's possessions. They don't even make sense if property is something that is a bad thing, or that if it's abolished.
Right.
Private property is a given. And so in that book of Acts section, it really was because of what Christ did for them, how could they not turn around and be givers themselves? But it's a voluntary distribution. It's not an involuntary one. And that's a huge, huge difference.
Well, I completely agree. And I do want to talk a little bit, because you mentioned Karl Marx. There are some significant differences between, let's say, the overarching philosophy, or even kind of the metaphysics, the idea of reality, between Jesus's worldview and, kind of a Karl Marx worldview. And I will say that not all socialists follow in line with Karl Marx, but I think we need to enter him into the conversation because of his outsized influence on kind of our modern political theory, or at least which would want to be the modern political theory. So as someone who has studied this, as someone who understands kind of these two people really well, Jesus and Karl Marx, can you talk about some of the differences in worldviews that those two individuals had?
Both were Jews. Ironically.
that is something they have in common, for sure.
Yeah. Ethnic Jews, but Marx rejected the metaphysical foundation, epistemology, and ethics. He rejected the entire worldview of his heritage, but Jesus did not. So there's a starting point.
Yeah.
Marx's view of human relations, his view of reality, was that people are defined by association within their class structure, either as oppressed or oppressor. And that's it. That's the fundamental relations of man. And as that's, evolved over the years, it's added some categories to that oppressed language, but that's it. And for Marx, the idea was that what I would call the fallacy of the zero-sum game, which affects all versions of Marxism today, whether it's Leninism, Maoism, critical theory, neo-Marxism, whatever. It's the idea that you have these oppressor-oppressed classes, and that inequality entails injustice everywhere. So that equality just is justice. Justice just is equality. That's a problem. Inequality is a mathematical notion. Justice is a moral notion. They're not the same. But in terms of the zero-sum game fallacy too, the idea was that if someone has more slices of the pie than someone else, it must be because they unjustly took that. They didn't earn that, as Obama told Joe the plumber. You didn't earn that, right? It's always unjust. Rather than seeing, let's say, a system like the free market system being the tide that rises all boats and enlarges the entire pie itself, even if it does entail some inequality, it still entails a greater living for the majority of people. Jesus's view was that reality is saints and sinners. There are people who are in rebellion against God, and there are people who are reconciled to God but are still sinners. But all these people have equality in that they are created in the image of God and have intrinsic value in that sense. Marx didn't view people as having intrinsic value. People could be used as a means to an end. And that's why in all his variations, from Lenin to Stalin to Mao to the critical theorist of today in America, humans are a means to an end. They're not ends in themselves.
Well, I want to acknowledge maybe a possible elephant in the room that comes off of what you just said there. I'm imagining someone watching this video and saying, look, there's two white guys, middle class, educated, talking about the poor and what Jesus should do. Aren't you guys very privileged, and you don't understand necessarily the plight or the needs of the oppressed. And so it's easy for you to just write that off as not necessary, or we shouldn't necessarily think about it, or Jesus didn't care about that. You're sitting in your privileged position to be able to make that judgment. How would you respond to someone that raises that sort of criticism?
Two, logic and ethics. On the logical note, that's guilty of the genetic fallacy. You
Okay.
see it in the abortion debate that men have no right to even speak on the issue because they're not women. Well, what if I give my argument for pro-life to the woman sitting next to me and she repeats it verbatim? What, now it's valid?
Right.
So the genetic fallacy is that it confuses the source of the belief with the rationality of the belief. So because I'm white and I stood before a panel on race relations, my opening line was, "Hi, my name's Corey. I'm white. Hi, Corey." And I brought up the genetic fallacy. This genetic fallacy, like the zero-sum fallacy, is found in every category, whether it is in the feminism, the racial justice, the economic justice, the climate justice, the LGBT justice, whatever. That's the epistemology issue, is that you can only know if you come from the oppressed class, right? You only are woke or truly enlightened if you come from the oppressed class. And that's just fallacious thinking. And we can show why. The ethical issue is that as a Christian, Christ has done more, and so have his followers, following the motive structure of being followers of Christ, for human history in the realm of compassion than anyone else in human history. And even premier ethicists like Peter Singer at Princeton will acknowledge the transformation of the world that Jesus brought. Even today, contemporary philanthropists, secularists will acknowledge that religious people in America and in Europe give more per capita than secular people, and conservative religious people give more per capita, even on secular causes, not just on religious causes, because our motive drive is to follow Christ. And so, where does the American Red Cross come from? Where does Compassion International come from, and so forth? Why are all the hospitals in the United States, most of them named after the Presbyterian Hospital, the Baptist Hospital, the Eliezer Hospital, Samaritan's Hospital? I don't see them saying Stephen Hawking Hospital or Richard Dawkins Hospital, right? Or the Buddha's Hospital. There's a reason for that, and it's not an accident.
Well, one thing that I do want to get your thoughts on is a method that I tend to use to try to draw this out in conversation with somebody. But ultimately, the next following subject that I want to get to is maybe a difference in methodology between local communities, state, and federal government and their different roles. And so first I'll start with, kind of one of the things that I always ask somebody that seems to have a position, as we're describing here, that Jesus is a socialist and that he would want people to give their money to the government via taxes in order to be able to help the poor, is how much extra they're paying in taxes already. And so I want to draw out the you have distrust in the government already, because if you didn't, you would just give any sort of donation. Let's just say that if you're an atheist, what you would give as a tithe, or even if you're a Christian that believes something along the lines that we've been describing, you would just give that extra to the state. And I haven't had one person, to my recollection, say that they give any extra to the state. Everyone always pays the minimum of taxes. Yeah. So do you think that is a valid form of questioning to kind of draw out some of their, kind of presuppositions in this debate? Because it seems like they really just want to have somebody else foot that bill. They'll say, well, we have the millionaires and billionaires, people making over $10 million. They should foot the bill. I'm not necessarily willing to pay extra, as where I think the Christian, what you were just saying, is the Christian, no matter where they are at on the income scale, they tend to give extra to Samaritan's Purse, to their local churches, to other nonprofits. I know, as you, as someone that's a CEO of a nonprofit, has that been your experience as well? And is that a valid kind of form of questioning that I'm using?
Yeah, I mean, you have to question people's motivation for giving. Why do I give? There's a book called Who Really Cares? by a philanthropist from Syracuse University.
Yep.
He claimed to be a liberal, and he did the data. He's worked in the field for 30 to 40 years. And he says that even someone who has the mentality, just the mere mentality of it's the state's job or the state will take care of this, who has a mentality of a welfare state, if that person merely has that mentality, as opposed to the skepticism of government and wants to do it on private charity and things like that, the fact of the matter is that person will almost always give less personally than someone who is a skeptic toward government giving as charity. So more charity is given away, actually. The world is helped more, actually, when we keep the money out of the hands of the politicians, who we know are always shady, usually.
Right.
They're inefficient, they're ineffective comparatively, than private or social groups that have a vested interest that is non-political.
No, I think that's right. And I think that leads right into my next question is, do you see a distinction in taxes or government or being willing to pay more taxes depending on the level of government in which is doing the distribution, let's say? So would you be more willing to give more money to your local government if they funded, homeless shelter or a food bank or something like that than you would to the federal government? Or do you kind of just take the position that across the board, we shouldn't be doing that? That's not government's role at all, whether it's my local government or whether it's the federal government or anywhere in between?
Yeah, that's a great question, trying to distinguish different forms of government too. Conservative thinkers on this, and by the way, I should make it clear too that socialism, strictly speaking, isn't what is depicted in America or across a lot of Europe. These are more or less welfare states that are heading towards socialism but aren't there yet.
Right.
When we look at something like America as a welfare state, it is right to make the distinction between local government and distant government in terms of who really cares, right? And who's going to be most efficient with my money. That's why we talk about Congress as people who better represent my state in the House of Representatives, who are more connected with the locals than the senators of the same state,
right?
Live in Washington. But when it comes to localized government too, I mean, those people live there. That's their backyard. Those are their very neighbors. And people are more likely to be better stewards with the resources, with people that they feel like that they've got skin in the game with, than someone they don't know from Adam, that's 2,000 miles away. And so, yeah, I think even if we were to give money to the government, local government is oftentimes better than distant government. But one difference between a libertarian outlook and a conservative outlook on this is the amount of government intervention. I think conservatives are a bit more open to saying, okay, better government is smaller government, but we do see that there are cases that render people incapable, unable to do for themselves, which is really the delineation for poverty in the biblical text.
Right.
It becomes a hand up, not a hand out. We want accountability for these resources. Otherwise, it really doesn't do much good for the person to become a welfare lifetime recipient who becomes a slug and almost a parasite. And it's not good for their own sense of dignity and encouragement in self-improvement either.
Well, and I think you're exactly right. And I think one of the additions that I would add on and kind of tack onto that is the role of the church should revolve around discipleship in caring. And I see no model for that in government assistance at all. I think I would be maybe more warm to the idea if there was, even on a local level, some sort of program or walking with people in relationship to help them with their budget, to look at their spending, to look at how you can continually improve your income or what you're saving. And I think that in the churches that I have been a part of, and even in the Christian organizations that I've been a part of, there has always been that desire to walk with people. For example, there was a church that I worked at back in the early 2000s, and they had a significant benevolence fund offering. Over $100,000 a year was given to this fund and was given back to the community in the form of car repairs, paying heating bills, paying missed rent, missed mortgage payments, as the people wouldn't lose the house. But there was always a sense of, we want to sit down with you and look at your spending, not as a quid pro quo, but as a way that we can help you work through this and avoid it in the future. Is this a pattern of spending? So what would you,
Right.
what would your comments on that be? The mode of relationship and discipleship in the church that may be lacking in the state?
Yeah, because and I served as a pastor as well. And I remember when poor people who were down and out, maybe just momentarily or something, when they would come wanting money, we had to, figure out, is this going to be worthwhile? Is this really going to help you, or are we just throwing this away? How can we help you as a person? Well, that's going to be done better on a local level than distant. And, this is one issue that comes up too, is in terms of biblical interpretation. We can't look to the Old Testament on some of these matters because it was a theocracy. In the New Testament, we find a very limited role of government, and that role is not as the minister of compassion. The state doesn't love us. It doesn't know us. It doesn't care about us. It's not in our neighborhood, generally speaking. It has no vested interest. The role of the church is the minister of compassion. The role of the state, Romans 13, is the minister of justice, to make sure unjust laws don't come about.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I know that you wanted to make a comment on the new senator, Raphael Warnock. Dr. Senator, Pastor, Reverend Warnock, one of the newly elected senators from Georgia. You held up something earlier that I wanted you to comment on before we wrap up today.
Yeah, Senator and Pastor Raphael Warnock said, this was back in January, the early church was a socialist church. Go back and read the Bible. I love to listen to evangelicals who stand on the Bible. Well, they had all things in common. They took everything. I'm preaching the Bible here. They took all the things they had in common, and they gave it out to everybody else. It's a basic principle. And in the nation and in the church, to whom much is given, much is required, we need to level the playing field. And to be concerned about the poor doesn't make you a socialist. It makes you a Christian. And it means that you believe that everybody is a child of God. I have so many problems with that. The Bible does not say everyone's a child of God. You have to be born again to be a child of God, John 1:12. And being compassionate or giving doesn't make you a Christian. That's something Christians do. That's the fruit of salvation, but not the root of salvation. And then second, yes, giving should be exhibited by genuine believers of Christ. But is that the job of the individual and the community? Or is that the job of the nation, the state? We know when we cast this off onto the state, people give less charitably, and it's less effective and less efficient. We'd know that from a secular research standpoint. So, yeah, if we're going to read the Bible for all it's worth, we need to read the Bible in its context and not try to impose our political viewpoints on the Bible.
Well, Corey, I appreciate your insight. I hope for our audience, if this is something that you struggle with, if you look out at the landscape of your community and your nation and you think, man, I wish we were more compassionate as a nation, I hope some of the things that Corey addressed challenged your thinking in that. And that one of the things that I thought was really interesting was the summation of this whole episode was in that last few minutes in his response to Reverend Dr. Senator Warnock, and what the church's role is, what our individual role is, and that is backed up by the statistics in the book, Who Really Cares, which I will leave a link to that book in the description for anyone that wants to read it. Corey, thank you so much for your willingness to be on and share some of your wisdom with the audience today.
Been great to be here, and God's fortune with you in the future.
Well, if anything that Corey said resonated with you today, I would just say thank you so much for sticking around, and you might want to consider subscribing and checking out some of our other videos if you find yourself on this journey of deconstructing. I hope something that Corey said helped you put one board back in your construction process of Christianity. I'll just remind you again that we have a Facebook group where you can dialogue and ask some different questions as you go through this journey. I want you to know that you're not alone, and I'll wrap up the way that I always wrap up. I hope that you will doubt towards faith. We'll see you next time on Dealing with Deconstruction.